Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. So in the weeks leading up to Easter, we have been looking at a lot of the events that took place in and around Holy Week. This special week that starts with Jesus triumphantly riding into Jerusalem and being celebrated like a king, and then going all the way through his crucifixion and death and resurrection only a week later. There's a lot of things that take place in this last week of Jesus' life. And over the last few weeks, we've looked at a lot of the important elements of that week. We talked about Jesus being anointed at Bethany right before riding into Jerusalem by a friend of his. And we talked about him going into the temple and casting out the money changers to cleanse the temple. And we talked about him having his Last Supper with his disciples, where he instituted the sacrament of the Holy Supper that we still participate in today. And we talked about Jesus praying in the Garden of Gethsemane when he had only hours left of his life, and he was undergoing the most harsh temptations that any human being had ever been through. But today we take a little bit of a step back and we go back to the beginning of Holy Week. We go to Palm Sunday, Jesus and his triumphant entry into Jerusalem, where people lined the streets and cheered for him, and they laid their clothing and palm branches down on the road to pave the way for him to enter into Jerusalem. And I think it's useful to take a moment to talk about why was Jesus riding into Jerusalem? What was the significance of this? And we might know that Jerusalem was kind of like a capital city for the Jewish nation, that this was where the temple was. This is where they worshiped. This is where they had all of their big festivals and things. This was a big hub of their life there. And yet Jesus didn't live in Jerusalem. This wasn't his home. This isn't even where he spent most of his ministry. If you were to look at a map of the Holy Land, there's a big Sea of Galilee up at the top, and then there's the River Jordan going down to the Dead Sea down at the bottom. And Jesus was from Nazareth, which was up by Galilee. He was up from the northern part of the land, and that was where most of his ministry took place. And Jerusalem was further south, down near the top of the Dead Sea. And so Jesus would make a journey to Jerusalem a few times a year to celebrate some important festivals or some important feasts. And so on Palm Sunday, the reason that Jesus was going into Jerusalem was to celebrate the Passover. That was the time of year that this was happening, and this is why Jesus was riding into Jerusalem. And so we can see maybe why it was so exciting to have him coming into Jerusalem, because at this point, he had made a name for himself. People had heard the stories of Jesus of Nazareth and the incredible miracles that he had done and the things that he had taught throughout his ministry. And so it was special to have him coming to visit Jerusalem. And like we talked about with the children, he rode in and was celebrated like a king. But he didn't ride in on a big horse, or he didn't come in with a big army behind him to show how powerful he was. But he rode in on a donkey. He rode in on this humble little animal, and that was how he rode into Jerusalem. So we've talked a little bit about the natural story here of why Jesus was going into Jerusalem. And with the children, we talked about the fact that there was prophecy that said that a king would come into Jerusalem riding on a donkey, and that was part of why he rode in on that animal. But what does this mean for all of us? What is the message that we can all take away from Jesus riding into Jerusalem on a donkey? Well, for that, I'd like to turn to the teachings of the new church, and I want to share a passage from the work, the Arcana Celestia, that talks about the significance of a donkey and the meaning of a donkey in the Word. This is Arcana Celestia, number 2781. We have inside us traits of will and traits of intellect. Traits that have to do with goodness are traits of the will, and those that have to do with truth are traits of the intellect. There are different kinds of animals that symbolize traits of will, which relate to goodness, including lambs, sheep, kids, she-goats, young cattle, and adult cattle. There are also animals that symbolize traits of intellect, which relate to truth, and they are horses, mules, wild donkeys, camels, and domesticated donkeys, not to mention birds. A horse symbolizes something intellectual, as shown above. A wild donkey symbolizes truth detached from goodness. A camel symbolizes facts in general, and a domesticated donkey, facts in particular. There are two components to our earthly level, or putting it another way, our earthly self. And those are earthly goodness and earthly truth. Earthly goodness is the pleasure that follows from neighborly love and faith. And earthly truth is the facts about both. Truth on the earthly level is what a donkey symbolizes, and truth on the rational level is what a mule symbolizes. So this passage is talking about the fact that we have these two sort of components to ourselves. We have our will and we have our intellect. And our will is the part of us that focuses on what we do and how we live and what our loves are and what our motivations are that drive us. That's the will side of who we are. And then the intellect side are the things that we understand. It's the teachings that we accept, that we believe. It's our worldview that helps us draw meaning out of our life. That is the intellect side. And so then there's animals that represent both of these sides. And it specifically talks about how a donkey represents individual teachings or individual facts in our intellectual side. And specifically, it represents truths on an earthly level. So the donkey represents these basic truths that we come to understand, these basic teachings about how we should live and what is right and what is wrong. Think of the kind of ideas that we teach to our children. That is what the donkey represents. And so Jesus rides into Jerusalem on a donkey. And so it's this basic understanding, these simple truths that the Lord rides in on. And he's riding into Jerusalem. And what does Jerusalem represent for all of us? Well, in the teachings of the new church, we're told that Jerusalem represents the church. But maybe not in the way that we would think about it. That when we hear the church, we might think of an organization, or we think of the faith that we all have, this shared sort of denomination, that's the church. But really what's represented by Jerusalem is the church within all of us. It represents the relationship that we have on an individual basis with the Lord. How do we go to him? How do we learn from him? And how do we allow the Lord to inspire and lead us in our life? That is what's represented by Jerusalem. And so Jesus rides into Jerusalem on a donkey. And this represents that the Lord enters into a relationship with us, that we are able to know him and have a relationship with him as our Lord by means of true ideas that he teaches us. These simple truths are what allow us to know the Lord and build a relationship with him. But again, we talked about with the children the fact that the Lord was viewed as a king, that when he came into Jerusalem, he was celebrated like a king. And the prophecy that talked about him riding in on a donkey calls him a king. And a king is someone who rules over other people. A king is someone who oversees an entire country, and they have to be in charge, and they make decisions, and they do things. But how does the Lord act as a king to us? How is the Lord able to lead us? How is he able to act in this role for us? And for that, I want to turn and read another passage from the teachings of the new church. This time, it comes from the work Divine Providence. And the entire book of divine providence really talks about the way that the Lord oversees everything in his creation, the way that the Lord acts as a lord or a king over the entire human race, and how he leads and guides all of us in our lives. And at the beginning of the book, it gives these laws of divine providence. And these are laws that the Lord has to follow. These are rules that the Lord has set out for himself of how he leads us, of how he oversees his creation. And the very first law that is given in this book about how the Lord leads all of us is it says that human beings must act in freedom according to their reason. So the Lord has to leave us in freedom. And so I want to read this passage that talks a little bit about how our freedom and our reason or our rationality are at work when the Lord is leading us and how this dynamic works. This is Divine Providence number 85. It says, "We say that it is by means of these two faculties, called rationality and freedom, that a person is reformed and regenerated, and that he cannot be reformed and regenerated apart from them. And the reason is that it is by virtue of rationality that he is able to understand and know what is evil and what is good, and thus what is false and what is true. And it is by virtue of freedom that he is able to will what he understands and knows. As long as the delight of an evil love reigns, however, he cannot will good and truth freely and make them matters of his reason. Consequently, he cannot make them his. For as we showed above, the things that a person does in freedom in accordance with his reason become attached to him as his. And unless they become attached as his, the person is not reformed and regenerated. A person then acts for the first time from the delight of a love of good and truth, when the delight of a love and evil and falsity has been removed. For two delights of love opposed to each other are not possible at the same time. To be moved to act by the delight of one's love is to act in freedom. And because one's reason is inclined to go along with this love, it is also to act in accordance with one's reason." So this passage is telling us that we have this dynamic with the Lord, where he is our king, he is the Lord, he is in charge, and he is leading us. And yet he has to lead us in freedom. We have to have the freedom to choose how we want to live. And the freedom to do that comes with our rationality, with our ability to think and decide for ourselves, well, what seems to be the right answer here? What seems to be right and wrong? And this is how the Lord acts as a king to us. This is how he leads us, by giving us teachings that help us to see how we can live a happy and meaningful life. The Lord rides into Jerusalem on a donkey. The Lord enters into a relationship with us by means of these ideas that he gives us, these teachings that he introduces to us, that he's given to us through his word and through systems of doctrine that help us understand what his word means. And when we see those truths in our lives, when we accept them and we apply them to our life, that is how we grow closer to the Lord. That is how we build a stronger relationship with him. And this, I think, is one of the most important elements of the story. That it's not just that Jesus rode into Jerusalem on a donkey, but what was he met with when he got there? He was met with crowds of people who were standing along the roads cheering and celebrating that he was there. Crowds of people who took the clothing off of their own backs to pave the way for the Lord to ride into Jerusalem. And this is the big takeaway for all of us. That we can be like these crowds who celebrate the Lord's arrival, who are happy to see him, and who pave the way for him to enter into Jerusalem riding on a donkey. And we can do this by opening ourselves up to the teachings that the Lord gives us, by going to him in his word, by talking to him in prayer, by inviting the Lord into our life, into our thoughts and our minds, and into our hearts and our will. That when we do this, when we open ourselves to the Lord, then we are like these crowds who pave the way for the Lord to ride into Jerusalem on a donkey. And in the same way, the Lord can enter into a meaningful relationship with each and every one of us, where he can teach us what is right and show us the pathway that leads to happiness and peace and meaning. Amen. Please rise for a blessing and the closing of the word.